So as I was just saying, we have a couple different goals for today's talk, and they are to increase our self-awareness of our thoughts, to increase our self-regulation of those thoughts, essentially how we can identify and change the counterproductive ones, and our self-efficacy, or our ability and knowledge that we are able to do something about those counterproductive thoughts. And so the skill set that we're going to go over today is you're going to learn what A plus T equals C means, and more on that in a minute. You're going to learn how to identify thinking traps, and you're going to learn how to challenge thinking traps. So to get started, we'll start with what is A plus T equals C? So you might have seen this written in other ways. A plus B equals C, an activating event plus belief equals consequences. This is just another way to think about it, but we like to call them thoughts versus beliefs because sometimes it's hard to identify the belief, but it's easier to identify the thought, and there's often a belief under that thought. So, in other words, this equation means that there's something happening when we have a big emotional tailspin that can happen. So out of nowhere, we have this big emotional reaction to a moment. And that moment happens so fast that it appears that only two things are happening, an event and an emotional reaction or consequence. And so oftentimes we get tricked into thinking that A equals C. But actually, when we're able to break that down, there are thoughts happening in between A and C. Simply put, it's an activating event plus our thoughts equals the consequences. So, for example, let's say on the way to work, you get a flat tire. And that flat tire is your activating event. The consequence is the emotional or psychological reaction you have to that activating event. When you get the flat tire, you might become angry. And your anger is the consequence. But why do you become angry? It may be because you're convinced you'll get fired if you show up too late one more time to work. Or it may be that you have a belief that bad things always happen to you, and this is just an example of one of those. Or it may be that you were angry that you don't know how to change a tire and feel incompetent. Or it could be that you're not angry at all. It might be that you know so-and-so at the local auto shop, and you were really excited to meet them, and you were hoping to ask them out for a date, and so the flat tire is an opportunity to do so, which is why an activating event doesn't equal a consequence. It's not guaranteed you're going to be angry because you get a flat tire. It kind of depends on the thoughts in between. So the reality is your thoughts are influenced by deep beliefs and self-talk that, when combined with an activating event, lead to the consequence. So, what are those thoughts? So we've identified several different what we call thinking traps. And they're listed here on this slide, and we're going to go over each one. So these are kind of the counterproductive, negative type thought patterns that tend to lead to a negative type of emotional reaction or consequence. So let's start with the catastrophizing. So this is where you're going to extreme conclusions with little evidence that support that extreme outcome. So let's give an example. You are calling a loved one. They don't answer. You wait 2 minutes. You call again. They don't answer. You wait 1 minute. You call again. They don't answer. Well, clearly, they're not answering because they've been in a major car accident, and you need to start calling highway patrol because they always answer their phone, and there's no way that they're okay, and this is a really big deal. Right? Well, maybe, or maybe not. So we'll talk a little bit about how to challenge each of these thinking traps, but this is an example of just one, catastrophizing. In other words, going to extreme conclusions with little evidence to support that outcome. Okay, so next one, all or nothing thinking. So this is where you come up with absolutes or extremes right, which minimizes the opportunities to see any other possibility as to why something is happening. One that pops out a lot to me is when I hear people say, I'm not good at math. Well, it may be that you weren't good at trigonometry, or maybe you weren't good at algebra, or maybe you weren't good at calculus, but you're really good at geometry, or you were really good, at other forms of math. But when someone has a failure in one area, this all or nothing thinking would be, I'm just not good at any of it. Or it might be, I didn't get along with someone at work, I'm just not going to talk to anyone today. This is an example of that all or nothing thinking. Okay, next one, personalizing. And I just want to pause here for a moment and say that if you have a question about any of these, feel free to unmute your line and ask and interrupt. That's totally fine. I'm a pretty informal speaker. Okay, so personalizing is another thinking trap. So when we personalize, we're taking fault for all the events or outcomes despite potential other possibilities. So this next slide I love because I feel like not only have I experienced this, but I've seen it happen many times. Are you guys ready for this? What's wrong? Says the man. Nothing. I'm good, says the woman. I can tell something is wrong. What did I do wrong? Seriously, I'm good, just tired. You're mad at me, I can tell. Now I am. So this is an example of personalizing where someone might take responsibility or fault before there's even evidence to suggest that it is even their fault, right? So someone might even be upset, but for a completely different reason than has to do with you, but your immediate thought reaction is, it's my fault. So that's personalizing.
That's classic.
Yeah, that's very classic. So another one is externalizing. So this is when faulting everyone else for something that happened without considering that you might have something to do with it. And there's a couple different examples of this. One example I like to give from my childhood is that I used to blame everything on the dog. And it wasn't because I knew I was at fault for something and I was just trying to get away with it by blaming it on the dog. There was times where I actually believed it was the dog's fault. And I couldn't see any possibility that I had done something to contribute to the situation. For example, the kitchen stinks. And I'm thinking, well, clearly it's that smelly dog stinking up the kitchen, obviously. It couldn't have anything to do with the fact that I forgot to take out the kitchen trash, right? So an example of externalizing. We see this a lot in children. For example, if you watch children and they run into a door, the first thing out of their mouth often is, the door hit me. It's not that they ran into the door hit them. It's externalizing. It's a natural part of development, and we grow out of it, but not all of us grow out of it totally or completely. So there is this tendency to externalize on fault. So that's externalizing. And then another one of the thinking traps is jumping to conclusions. So jumping to conclusion is when we create reasons for actions or behaviors without relying on any evidence, really. And the next slide I have as an example is a very classic example as well. Text message. Are you there? No response. What's going on? No response. Are we breaking up? So just because they didn't respond doesn't mean you're breaking up. It might mean, I don't know, they're in the bathroom. So jumping to conclusions is immediately going to a conclusion without any evidence to support that conclusion. And then here is another very classic one, mind reading. So this is where you think what you know what others are thinking, or that when you expect they should know what you are thinking. This picture is a great example of that. So we can think of examples even in the workplace or in our personal relationships where you might have an expectation that something should happen, but you never voice that expectation. And then you're angry because your partner or your friend doesn't realize that expectation that you have. and then doesn't follow through on it. How dare they not read your mind, right? So this is mind reading. And then overgeneralization, or a belief about ability or worth based on limited information. So this really gets down to that worthiness thing. I'm not good enough, as being the foundational response to things when things don't go the way you're expecting. An example of this is, I just started my own business, and I sent out emails with information about my business, asking my friends and family for feedback about my business, and none of them have responded. It's because they hate me and they don't like my idea. I'm terrible at this. I don't even know why I'm even trying to start my own business. So chances are you either have had this thought process before, or you know someone who tends to rely on this thought process before. Overgeneralization, assuming that your self-worth is to blame for some sort of active action or event. So is there any questions so far on the thinking traps that we've covered?
No.
Great. So challenging thinking traps. It's important to be able to identify them. We just went over each one individually so that hopefully you'll be able to identify when they're happening with examples. But the important part is being able to challenge them. So we unintentionally focus only on the evidence that supports our thinking traps. This is called a confirmation bias, meaning we have this thinking trap, and then we look for the evidence to only support that belief or thought. To get around the confirmation bias, we have to search for evidence that supports the counter argument. Is there evidence to support the contrary? So, for example, I might be jumping to conclusions, right? Texting my boyfriend or girlfriend, and they're not responding, and so I start to jump to conclusions. They want to break up with me. Well, you can take a moment and say, is there any evidence to support the contrary? Is there any evidence to suggest that they don't want to break up with me? Well, we just talked 20 minutes ago, and they said that they love me. Okay, well, that's some pretty strong evidence to support the contrary, right? So eventually, there will be enough evidence to support the contrary that the belief behind the thinking trap begins to disintegrate. Here's another question you can ask yourself. This is the one for mind reading. Did you ask what they are thinking? Did you state what you were thinking? So if you ever find yourself disappointed by unmet expectations, take a moment and ask yourself, did you ever state your expectations? Or when you catch yourself thinking you know what someone else is thinking, during a conversation, I think this happens a lot. People get really afraid of judgment, and they start to assume that someone's judging them. Did you ever ask them what they're thinking? Here's another one. What are the other possible reasons for this? So let's go back to that example where we called a family member and they didn't answer. And so then we started thinking, oh my gosh, catastrophizing, they're in an accident. They must be. What are the other possible reasons they didn't answer their phone? Well, maybe they're driving and they're not answering the phone as they shouldn't be. Maybe they're in the bathroom. Maybe their ringer's off. Maybe their battery's dead. Maybe they lost their charger. There could be all sorts of reasons as to why they are not answering their call, right? And then this one is there any evidence to support this? So this is a great one for when we're jumping to conclusions without any evidence to support it. Because if we ask ourselves, well, is there any evidence to support this conclusion that they want to break up with me? Them not answering a call isn't a great evidence when there's lots of evidence to point to the contrary. And finally, what is the most likely case scenario? This is a great one for catastrophizing as well. They didn't answer But what's most likely the situation? Is it most likely that they got in a car accident, or is it just most likely that they can't hear their phone ringing? Right? Now, these seem obvious, but it takes mindfulness to be aware of when you're having a thinking trap, and then to take that moment and ask yourself one of these questions. So let's take a minute to increase some self-awareness. So I'd like you to take out a piece of paper and a pen and just take about 30 seconds or so and ask yourself, which of these thinking traps do you use? As we went through each one and I gave examples, which of those stuck out to you as, oh yeah, I've done that, or something similar to that? So go ahead and take the next 30 seconds to think about that and write down whichever thinking traps resonate the most with you. Go ahead and wrap that up, just 5 more seconds. Okay, so hopefully that little time of reflection helps you identify which thinking traps that feel most familiar to you. And then just take another 30 seconds and ask yourself, which of these thinking traps that we reviewed does your family or close friends tend to use? So take a moment. You can write down their name and which trap that seems the most familiar to you, that is often associated with them. So go ahead and take that time now, about 30 seconds. Okay, great. So my hope in taking the time for you to think about which thinking traps you use and which your close family and friends use is because then that awareness will help you bring mindfulness into those conversations, that when they pop up again, you can say, oh, wait, I learned a new skill. I learned how to challenge these thinking traps. And to do so, these are the questions that we can ask. And as a reminder, here they are here. My favorite one that often works for most of them is there evidence to support the contrary? Is there evidence to support the opposite of what I'm thinking is happening here? So, as with anything, with new skills, it's important that we practice them. So here's where I'm going to ask you guys to take yourselves off mute and engage with me. And the way this is going to go is I'm going to give you a scenario for me that I'm in, and I'm going to explain what that scenario is, and then you guys get to be my thinking traps. You guys get to tell me various thoughts or beliefs that might be counterproductive for me or might be self-limiting as I'm considering this scenario. And I am going to challenge them. Okay? Are you guys ready?
Ready.
Ready.
Okay. So here's the scenario. I was asked, and this is actually a real scenario, I was asked to give a speech to all the nation's county managers on employee and well-being, like employee happiness and well-being. And as you can imagine, it's one of the bigger speaking events I've been asked to do. And I'm currently 36 years old. I've been in my current job for 5 years. And my boss happens to be a deputy county manager, which is why I'm been given this opportunity, because he knows my current skill set. But you can imagine that there could be some fears or concerns or doubts that might come up with such an opportunity. So thinking of catastrophizing with public speaking, all or nothing thinking, or any of the other thinking traps, externalizing, jumping to conclusions, overgeneralization, or mind reading, I'm going to ask you guys to come up with some thinking trap thoughts for me based on the idea that I'm being asked to give this speech on happiness and well-being to all the nation's county managers. Ready, set, go.
You might be afraid of embarrassing yourself, making mistakes.
Yeah, I totally might embarrass myself and make mistakes. Well, if I make a mistake, I will be able to take a pause and breathe. And I've given public talks many times, and I know how it goes when you start to fumble over your words. And most people don't know about those mistakes anyway, so they don't know what you had intended to say. Next one.
Yeah. Well, you know, Katie, I mean, most of these managers have been, they're older aged and been in their positions for years, and how are you going to be able to influence them into changing?
Right, overgeneralization. How am I worthy enough to speak to these people with all this experience? My experience can't be enough, right? Okay, well, is there any evidence to the contrary? You're right. I don't have a lot of evidence, but I wouldn't be asked to speak at this event by the county's deputy manager of Coconino if they didn't believe that I had the skill set to provide this talk. Next.
Maybe being afraid that everyone will judge you and think that you're faking it.
Yes. That's actually a really good one you bring up, John, because there's actually a term for that. It's called imposter syndrome, right? Being terrified that somehow they're going to realize you don't know as much as everyone thinks you do. So, and that's kind of a overgeneralization of self-worth, as well as potentially mind reading, right? Well, I don't know everything, so as long as I present only the information that I can confidently present and don't overstate what I know, then I won't be held accountable for presenting anything that I'm not familiar with. How about any more? Can you guys think of any more?
Depending on how much time you had to prepare, if you could say, if you fail, it's your boss's fault because he didn't give you enough warning.
Yeah, it's totally his fault, obviously, right? But that's when I always have a choice, right? So if he asked me to give this talk with only 2 weeks' notice, I have a choice to say yes or to say no. And if I agree to that, then whose fault is that really? Right. Great. You guys did great. So it's a great practice because as we went through the examples of thinking traps, those examples make a lot of sense, but in real life they look and feel so many different ways, right? As you guys brought up all of those, they covered things like jumping to conclusions, overgeneralization, mind reading, catastrophizing, right? And we do these pretty effortlessly because they tend to be related to some deep-seated beliefs we have. So that's why it's important to notice when those thoughts are coming up and then be able to say, yeah, but what is some evidence to the contrary? Or is there any evidence to suggest that that might not be true? So my hope then is that from our talk today, you were able to absorb 3 forms of skills, right? You now know what A plus T equals C is, right, which is an activating event plus a thought equals a consequence, and that you now know the importance of having some mindfulness, especially when you notice a big emotional reaction to something. That is your clue that a thinking trap is probably happening. So, yep, we know that what that means, A plus T equals C. Then we talked about how to identify thinking traps. One of them, the first clue, is the big emotional reaction to something, and then taking the time to know what the thinking traps are and identifying where they're coming from. So, yep, we covered that. And then we covered how to challenge thinking traps with those various questions. And one of my favorites being, is there any evidence to the contrary? So, for example, when you said, and one of you said something about, well, you know, you're not very experienced. You're young. You know, you don't have enough experience. Well, then why are they asking you to speak in the first place? That's that question of, is there any evidence to the contrary? If I don't have the experience they're seeking, then they wouldn't ask me, right? Okay. So, reminder of our goals, which was to increase self-awareness, which that's why we spent some time thinking about thinking traps that we might personally have experience with, and those that are friends and our family. And then then our other two goals were increasing self-regulation, which is essentially being able to regulate those thinking traps by challenging them, and then having some self-efficacy, a belief that you're able to do it. The truth is, though, the regulation and self-efficacy are going to be built when you spend some time doing some homework. So my assignment to you is to spend time with a close friend or family member and role play this with them. Teach them about the thinking traps. I emailed each of you a handout on the thinking traps so that you can be reminded of what they are. And then you can come up with scenarios of your own and have them be your thinking traps. And then practice challenging them. And in that practice, you start to build more regulation of your thoughts and more self-efficacy that you have the ability to change them. So, that's all I have for you guys today. Is there any questions?
No, this would be very useful.
Oh, good. I'm glad that you feel so. Great. Well, I implore you to tell everyone else you know about it that you might have written down on your piece of paper, and if they're open to it, role-playing with them so that you can further your learning by teaching as well. So thanks for joining me today, and if you have any further questions, feel free to call me or email me.
All right.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.